They dragged her out of her own compound that morning, and nobody in Ajegunle raised their hand to stop them. Mama Chinwe, 62 years old, still in her wrapper and slippers, was being called a witch by the same neighbors who used to greet her every morning. If you've ever watched someone you trust get destroyed by rumors before the truth even had a chance to speak, you need to hear this story to the end, because what happened next will remind you why we never judge too fast. And if stories like this move you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. It started on a quiet Tuesday. Mama Chinwe's daughter-in-law, a young woman named Blessing, had rushed her only son, little Kosi, to the hospital with a high fever. By the time they got there, the boy was already weak, his small chest rising and falling too fast. The doctors fought through the night, but by morning, Kosi was gone. He was only 4 years old. Grief in Lagos does not stay quiet. Within hours, word had spread through the streets that Kosi had died suddenly, and somebody needed a reason. Somebody needed a face to place the pain on. And in a family where the mother-in-law had never fully accepted her son's choice of wife, that face became Mama Chinwe. She never liked Blessing from the beginning, one neighbor whispered. She said the marriage would not last, another added. You know these old women and their charms, someone else muttered, shaking their head. By evening, Blessing herself, drowning in her own sorrow, began to believe it too. She remembered small things now, twisted into something sinister. The times Mama Chinwe visited without calling first, the way she used to hold Kosi a little too long, whispering things in Igbo that Blessing didn't understand. Grief does that to a person. It makes you search for someone to blame, because blaming fate feels like too much to carry alone. Mama Chinwe's own son, Ebuka, a quiet man who worked as an electrician, stood frozen between the two women he loved most, his wife and his mother. He didn't know who to believe, and his silence was the loudest thing in that compound. By the third day, it wasn't just whispers anymore. A small crowd had gathered outside Mama Chinwe's gate. Someone brought up an old story about a neighbor's goat that died mysteriously years ago, and somehow that story now belonged to Mama Chinwe too. Someone else said they'd seen her talking to herself at night. Every strange memory anyone had ever collected about the old woman came pouring out at once, stacking up like evidence in a court that had already decided its verdict. She should leave this compound, a man shouted. Where is the landlord? Call the landlord, a woman added. Mama Chinwe stood by her doorway, her hands shaking, not from guilt, but from disbelief. She kept saying the same thing over and over. I held that boy since he was born. Why would I hurt my own grandson? But grief has no ears for logic. Nobody was listening. It was Ebuka's younger sister, Ifeinua, who lived 2 streets away, who finally arrived that afternoon. She had heard the commotion from a friend and rushed over, still in her work clothes. She pushed through the crowd and stood beside her mother, refusing to let her stand alone. Everybody wants to talk, Ifeinua said loudly, her voice cutting through the noise. But did anyone ask Nurse Patricia what really happened at that hospital? The crowd went quiet. Nobody had thought to ask. Nurse Patricia was the young woman who attended to Kosi that night. Ifeinua had already called her, and within the hour, the nurse arrived, still in her scrubs, her face tired from a long shift. She stood in front of the same crowd that had been ready to chase an old woman out of her home. The child had severe malaria that had gone untreated for days, Nurse Patricia said clearly. By the time he was brought in, the infection had already spread. I documented everything. This was not sudden. This was a fever that was ignored because everyone assumed it was just ordinary catarrh. Silence fell over the compound like a heavy blanket. Blessing's hands flew to her mouth. She remembered now, the 2 days before, when Kosi complained of body pain, and she had given him a home remedy instead of going to the clinic because money was tight that week and she thought it would pass. Nobody had bewitched anybody. A child had simply been sick, and sickness, untreated, can take a life quietly and without any cause attached to it. The crowd that had gathered to condemn Mama Chinwe began to disappear one by one, shame written on their faces where anger used to be. Blessing turned to her mother-in-law, tears streaming down both of their faces, and for the first time in 3 days, they held each other, not as accuser and accused, but as two women who had both lost the same little boy. Mama Chinwe didn't ask for an apology from the neighbors. She simply returned to her small room, sat on her bed, and allowed herself to finally grieve for the grandson everyone had forgotten to mourn while they were busy searching for someone to blame. Sometimes the truth doesn't shout. It waits quietly in a hospital file, in a nurse's tired voice, in the one person who refuses to join the noise.
If this story touched you, don't scroll past without subscribing, because there are many more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories that remind us to listen before we judge, and to look for truth before we look for someone to hurt.